Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Welcome to our sixth episode of Conversations with World Philosophies, Conversaciones con Filosofías del Mundo. Just in case, for those of you who are new to the series, this is a series of conversations between philosophers from different countries, trying to demonstrate that non-traditional Western academic philosophy is not only a living tradition, but is also one of the most interesting approaches to, or offers interesting approaches to contemporary everyday philosophical problems. Today, we're quite glad to have two guests, Professors Munamato Chempuru and Professor Jose Jorge de Carvalho. I pronounce it in Spanish. I hope you'll forgive me, Professor Carvalho. Anyways, Professor Chempuru is an expert on African environmental philosophy. He has edited a volume of essays on the subject, for those of you who are interested. Professor Carvalho has a very, very long academic career trying to create precisely what Conversations with World Philosophies is working with. The idea of an intercultural dialogue in Brazil. Professor Carvalho's work has not only been very, very important academically, but contrary to what happens to most of us philosophers, his work actually has public impact, and his policies have been taken up by sections of the Brazilian government. I hope Professor Carvalho can tell us a little about that during his presentation. So, as in other occasions, we will have both professors present small lectures on the topic. If at any point any member has a question, you're more than welcome to write it down in the YouTube chat, and we will make sure that the question is read and hopefully answered by our participants at the end of the section. So with that, I leave you with Professor Munamato Chempuru.
Thank you, Philip. Firstly, I would like to thank you, Philip, as well as Carlos, for being in touch with me and for the arrangement of this conversation. I also wish to thank my co-presenter, Professor Carvalho, as well as everyone else who is online. And I would like to thank you for joining us for this particular conversation. The title of my presentation is Environmental Ethics from an African Philosophical Perspective. As an introduction to my presentation, firstly, in this presentation, I wish to highlight that I do not want to pretend that African communities are unanimous on all issues that I will discuss because of the diversity of such communities. However, notwithstanding that variety among these African communities and cultures, I will note that there still remain some philosophical aspects of these African communities that support much of their value systems, such that it will be difficult to ignore their somewhat universal import to environmental ethics in general. So this is what gives me the courage to at least speak of environmental ethics from the perspective of African philosophy. And I would like to first highlight that the story of African environmental ethics is in the book of African philosophy. And what do I mean by that? I'm trying to say that the best way to approach African environmental ethics will be to read the book of African philosophy. In other words, to understand the nature of African philosophy. And I'll give you some bit of background to African philosophy, in case some of us may not be aware of some of the politics that has been behind the story of African philosophy. The problem of the history of African philosophy is that it is punctuated by some sort of denial of existence, or denial of its existence, especially around about the 18th century, 19th century, especially by some Eurocentric thinkers such as Immanuel Kant, Hegel, as well as we see, like in the 20th century, some anthropologists like Raoul Alia, with the title of one of his book on Africans titled The Mind of the Savage. There is also William Brailsford in 1935 with another fascinating title to his book, Primitive Philosophy. All these are with reference to African philosophy. However, we see around about the mid of the 19th century, another missionary working in Congo, Placid Temples, with a book titled Ubuntu Philosophy. That book was some kind of a game changer on perceptions on Africans and African philosophy around about the mid 20th century. And besides this, thanks to the writings of the late 20th century and 21st century African philosophers who now came on board. Like we have the likes of Emmanuel Onyewenyu, Paulino Ontonji, Henry Odera Oruka, Kwezi Wiredu, Kwame Gyeke, Ramos, Magobe Ramos, a South African philosopher. These now responded to some of these Eurocentric views about African philosophy. And because of them, we now have a considerable body of literature on African philosophy. Of course, this had even the rejection of African philosophy by Hegel and company. This does not mean that African philosophy did not exist, even if they wanted to deny it. And even if we also have this considerable body of literature which is affirming the existence of African philosophy, it also does not imply that prior to them we did not have African philosophy. So I will not venture much into this old debate which has already been settled, because no one really doubts now that African philosophy exists. Apart from that background on African philosophy, I will also highlight some bit of background that also is has to do with the history of environmental ethics broadly. So now I've moved from history of philosophy, some little bit of history of environmental ethics broadly, not particularly African environmental ethics. So history of environmental ethics, I think you agree with me that it is characterized by some little bit of fallacy that it is new, or that environmental ethics is new, or that it is a new approach in history of humanity, or that it develops after round about the first and the second industrial revolutions in Europe. Of course, most environmental problems that we are currently witnessing, like global warming, climate change, extinction of species and biodiversity, etc., they somewhat began to be felt at a large scale, mostly after the first and second industrial revolutions in Europe. And this prompts most of the philosophers in the 20th century and 21st century to believe that human beings need some sort of a new ethics in the form of environmental ethics. Yet environmental problems and environmental ethics have always been part of the history of humanity. And the same applies to the nature of African environmental ethics, which I now move to look at. So first, in order to dispel some of the misconceptions around African environmental ethics, I consider the history and the nature of African environmental ethics is aptly captured by the argument which goes like, my first premise is that African environmental ethics is closely knit in African philosophy. And my second premise is that African philosophy has always been part and parcel of African people's existence. With that reasoning, I come to the conclusion that African environmental ethics is as old as the history of the African people. However, the reason why African environmental ethics is only visible after around about the second half of the 20th century is because African environmental ethics has been following the direction of African philosophy, like I have highlighted, at least in terms of it being an undocumented philosophy until recently. Thus, I would not want to commit the same mistake made about African philosophy of assuming that African environmental ethics is new simply because it has not been in academic writings. Sorry, simply because it has been included in academic writing lately. Thus, in looking at the nature of such African environmental ethics, first, it is important to emphasize that the nature of environmental ethics has to do with African philosophy and African approaches to fundamental questions about environmental issues, such as, for example, questions to do with moral status of the environment, also how human beings ought to relate with it, and treat non-human beings like animals and the rest of nature. Second, African environmental ethics ought to be looked at as a complete philosophy or an ethical outlook in its own right. It is not a second-order philosophy to any, like Western philosophy, which has the tendency to claim some kind of epistemic universality. Third, African environmental ethics is closely tied to African philosophy and existence, such that the way to approach it would be to understand African philosophy and the idea of existence, is the idea of ontology, like what I will now seek to show. So I will first look at the African ontology-based view of environmental ethics. And this idea of ontology has to do, like I have indicated, with the idea of being or existence in general. So the idea of how existence is conceptualized in African philosophy has some strong and far-reaching implications for environmental ethics. For example, African environmental ethics is characterized by the following conceptions of existence, which are the conceptions that I'll be looking at throughout this presentation. First, we have an African communitarian existence as one of the major characteristics of this ontology-based view. Second, we have an African relational view of existence. Third, we have what is called the existence in accordance with the philosophy of Ubuntu or UNU. These are technical African languages or African words. Fourth, we have an African teleological view of existence. And fourth, I'll look at the theocentric view of existence. So all these views of existence, I'll examine them in terms of how they have some import to environmental ethical thinking. So all that, I'll look at it as ontology-based environmental ethical thinking. So for each of these, I show how the idea of existence in African philosophy has strong implications for environmental ethics. I will start with the African communitarian environmental ethics. And in my consideration of African communitarian environmental ethics, I do not wish to pretend that communitarianism is an exceptionally African or is exceptionally an African approach. As they also exist other variants of communitarianism in African traditions, like, for example, in the Aristotelian political philosophy. We also see it in McIntyre, in Sandel, Tyler, and Walser, especially their response to Rawls' liberal theory. However, I focus on communitarianism in its African variant. And first, communitarianism is one of the defining features of existence in African ontology, philosophy. And by communitarianism, I mean the view that essentially emphasizes on the connection between the individual and the community, but more on the importance of the community rather than that of the individual. Like in pre-colonial Africa, communitarian existence was the order of the day. And during the colonial era in Africa, for example, the view was mostly popularized by African nationalist thinkers such as Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and Leopold Sedar Senghor in Senegal. And they wanted to mobilize fellow Africans to resist colonialism as a united people in their quest for independence. So they mobilized people around the idea of communitarianism. And in the African Academy recently, you will see like John Beatty, Ifeanyi Menkiti, and Kwame Gyeke. They have also written a lot about the idea of communitarianism. For example, Mbiti's famous dictum that, I think this is something that is not new to you, the idea that I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. It aptly captures the African communitarian view of existence, which can be understood to mean that one's existence is essentially understood by reference to other people's existence, such that it is not possible to conceive the person as an individual being. Of course, there is a tension that is usually between those who hold the radical view of communitarianism and those who hold the moderate view, especially with regard to the question of individual autonomy. Very important. For now, I will not dwell into that debate for obvious reasons that have been given against the objections for the radical view. I will operate within the framework of a moderate view as the most acceptable view of communitarian thinking. I will consider this African communitarian outlook as emphasizing on aspects such as group solidarity, shared communal values, collective goods and ends, and social relationships. The import of such communitarian view of environmental ethics cannot therefore be taken for granted so long as the understanding of the person, the community, and the environment is taken as connected to each other. Such a view of the community has some sort of an extended meaning to include the entire environment into some sort of an ecological community. Implicitly, the inseparability of persons from others means that persons are essentially the sort of beings who are always in ethical relationships and connections with other humans and non-human beings. This ecological communitarianism from African communitarian philosophy is supported by various non-anthropocentric reasons, such as, for example, the capacity by some non-human beings to be in some sort of relationships with human beings, the moral status and welfare of non-human beings, possession of life by some beings, and aspects like vitality among others. Even in terms of distributive patterns, like, for example, in environmental justice issues, African communitarianism is essentially distributive. However, that perspective, for now, I will not look at it. I will not look at that distributive view because it is not part of what I want to present today. But overall, while African communitarianism cannot be overemphasized in terms of its environmental ethical import, it is also strengthened by the nature of relationships between human beings that also constitute the ecological community at large. In addition to the import of African communitarianism to environmental ethics, in addition, the import of African communitarianism to environmental ethics is also closely knit together with the idea of relationships, such that it will not be possible to examine the import of African communitarianism without reference to relationships within the African communitarian context. So now I proceed to look at the second aspect, which also strengthens the African communitarian perspective or the ontological perspective in the form of African relational environmental ethics. The notion of relationships has to do with the idea of what it means to be related among beings, among the various beings, and what that implies to environmental ethics as well. Within African communitarian philosophy, for example, the idea of relationships has strong implications for environmental ethics, and these relationships could be conceptualized as not only among human beings per se, but that they go beyond to include aspects of the environment like non-human beings. For example, one way to think about these relationships is that human beings, for example, the presently living human beings are related to each other by virtue of being human and sharing a life on planet Earth. They are also directly or indirectly related to their future future generations to come. Thus, human beings have obligations, or they ought to have obligations to treat the environment in ways that do not affect their related beings, like their fellows and these future generations. This view is key to environmental ethics, including intergenerational environmental ethics, where, for example, the present generation ought to have obligations to respect and take into consideration the needs of the future generations because they are also related to them in various ways. Of course, this view or this approach could be objected for being somewhat anthropocentric because the duties to treat the environment are motivated by the need to safeguard the interests of fellow human beings. Such duties are not direct environment, but they are kind of indirect duties towards the environment. Nevertheless, despite such an objection, there is a normative transition that could be made from human relationships to construct other relationships involving human beings and non-human beings on the basis of what the Malawian philosopher John Mweshi sees as, for example, the appreciation of interconnectedness and interdependencies among various beings in the environment. Also, African relational ethics is based on the totemic system, whereby a person sees oneself as related to certain natural species, like animals. This view is responsible for instilling a sense of belonging to the wider environment and bringing human beings closer to nature because of the relational implications of totems. For example, individuals in African ontology belong to various families, and these families respect and effectively should not kill, for example, certain totem animals such as rhino, elephants, among others, reptiles, fish, etc., etc. So each of these families belong to one of these aspects of nature. So the environmental ethical import of totems is based on relationships between the totem animal and the human community. The idea is almost similar to the scenario where, for example, an individual cannot marry from one's family or from a family with the same blood ties. An individual cannot marry from the same family or from the same family with the same blood ties. Similarly, certain animal species are honored and respected as totems or totem animals because they are related to human beings. However, this view could be taken as if it gives moral status to non-human beings on the basis of degree of relationships with human beings. Hence, it is sometimes criticized for being somehow inherently anthropocentric because the basis for according moral status to non-human animals is dependent on their relationships with human beings. Accordingly, such a relational view is based on partiality towards human beings and could be a little bit objected for that. But notwithstanding such an objection, however, the attempt to understand the moral relationships between human beings and non-human beings on the basis of what sort of relationships exist between such beings is an important conception of relational ethics from African philosophy. And apart from the idea of relationships, there is also another important relational philosophy which also adds to the African ontological and communitarian environmental ethics. And that view is called the philosophy of Unu or Ubuntu. Apart from appealing to, so this is a philosophy that I will not look at the idea of Ubuntu or Unu. These are Shona, this is a Shona. Unu is actually a Shona word, and Ubuntu, it can be a Zulu word or a Ndebele word. These are Southern African languages. Apart from appealing like to relationships involving human beings and non-human beings as the basis for environmental ethical consideration, there is also a connected African philosophy of existence that is more focused on what it means to be a human being as the basis for environmental ethics. This philosophy is commonly expressed in most Southern African languages, such as Shona, Ndebele, Zulu, Soto, and Xhosa. These languages are mostly spoken in the parts of Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Botswana, and Angola, among other countries. So, according to this philosophy of Ubuntu, there's also a very famous dictum that is aptly captures this idea. And it goes like, Munu, munu navantu, or umuntu, ngumuntu ngabantu. This is Shona and Ndebele. This means that a person is a person through others. This expression articulates a relational conception of existence among human beings because it means that human beings are essentially communitarian and naturally related beings. Such a perspective is not far from communitarian views that I've already looked at, but this one goes deeper than the ontological view. The African philosophy of Unu or Ubuntu could loosely be understood as implying a conception of humaneness, which is expected to be essentially inherent in human beings by virtue of being human. According to such a view, what it means to be a human being, that's Unu or Ubuntu, also largely concretizes African relational ethics and is also central to a conception of environmental ethics. Accordingly, Unu or Ubuntu is understood both ontologically and epistemologically. Ontologically, for example, Unu or Ubuntu, it points to beingness or existence in general. South African philosopher Mogobe Ramos argues that the term Ubuntu is derived from two conjunctions. Ubu, like you, be you. Ubu, implying the idea or notion of being or existence in general, and in two, signifying the nodal point at which beingness achieves fullness or concrete form. Epistemologically, Unu or Ubuntu could be ethically understood to imply a conception of ethical character within the individual. And this, from this perspective, Unu could be taken to mean the trait of humaneness that enables individuals to treat other human beings and non-human beings with kindness, with compassion, respect, care, among others. In the ontological sense, Unu or Ubuntu is essentially intrinsic among all human beings by virtue of their existence as human beings, while in the epistemic sense, Unu could only be found in human beings as a disposition, and in particular, some human beings that may have that kind of moral aptitude. Otherwise, it is possible for some human beings to lack Unu or Ubuntu in the epistemic sense in certain situations because it is a relative idea and that it might either be attained or lost at some point in time. However, it remains a desired moral disposition among all human beings. Nevertheless, both the ontological and epistemic conceptions of Unu or Ubuntu are fundamental to environmental ethics because beingness and humanness are not limited to humanity or human existence only. This explains why, for example, it is possible to judge human beings in terms of whether they possess or lack Unu or Ubuntu or this humaneness in how they relate with other non-human beings and how they treat natural environment. It is not possible that it is not possible that Unu or Ubuntu might be realized without reference to the relational existence of human beings with the rest of the world. Thus, Unu or Ubuntu provides a comprehensive ethical framework for conceptualizing human and non-human relationships in African relational environmental ethics. And overall, Unu or Ubuntu is thus an aspect of African relational ethics which is useful to an understanding of environmental ethics because of its emphasis on the duties not only to fellow human beings, but also towards other beings that may not directly be related to human beings because Unu demands humaneness beyond human community. Other than Ubuntu, there is also a teleological dimension to African environmental ethics as well. So I will quickly move to that African teleological view, environmental ethics, and highlight that this view is based on like an understanding of the question of being or existence again as teleologically oriented and connected towards some sort of purpose for existing. Of course, the idea of purpose or telos for existing might not be so clear, but I think we all agree that as human beings, we all strive to live well, we all strive to live a good life and to support life as well. Although this teleological view could be traced like to the Aristotelian tradition, it is also characteristic of African ontology-based view of environmental ethics. And from African conceptions of existence, each of the aspects of existence, including non-human beings, are looked at as if they have some reason or end for existing, which is independent. The purpose for human beings or to the purposes for human beings for surviving. This view is based on the understanding that each aspect of reality has an end in itself. At the same time, all reality is thought to have some purposive function of strengthening and supporting the existence and well-being of other beings or lives than to work against them. Similarly, what human beings could do in order to further the purpose of the environment is to let various aspects of the environment exist, live, and blossom in different ways because various beings have various ends and purposes. All beings are therefore teleological counterparts in the realm of existence, according to that view. And one of the bases for granting moral status to aspects of the environment is that they have independent existence and teleological orientation. The other view is that, except for the moral status of non-human animals, which could be granted on the basis of aspects like sentience, the physical environment or the physical parts of the environment is also where human beings and non-human animals thrive and realize their purpose or purposes for existing, while it also has its own purpose at the same time for being what it is. It will therefore be the basis on which to grant moral status to physical environment using this teleological view. Although this view might be understood as also oriented towards anthropocentrism, it could be taken as the basis for granting moral status to various aspects of the environment, such as non-human animals and non-animate reality, because they not only sustain life, but they have independent purposes for being what they are. Another important, apart from that, another important aspect of African ontology, which I think I'll look at lastly, is the African theocentric view of environmental ethics. And according to this view, it is based on the acceptance of the metaphysical existence of certain beings and their relationships with all beings that are within the African ontological hierarchy of existence. For example, existence is seen as hierarchically placed and going beyond the empirical to include, for example, the supreme beings, maybe God, the ancestors, human beings, non-human beings, non-human like animals, as well as non-animate reality or physical aspects of environment. Of course, despite its metaphysical, supernatural, and sometimes superstitious premises on which it can be criticized, this view emphasizes on harmonious relationships in the hierarchy of existence among all these beings that I have highlighted, like spiritual beings, humans, and non-human beings. So it is a kind of a holistic attitude that is captured by one philosopher, Ikenobe, a Nigerian philosopher. He captures it as follows. He argues that traditional African view of ontology can be understood in terms of their view of cosmology. Reality is seen as a composite, a unity, and harmony of natural forces. Reality is a holistic community of mutually reinforcing natural life forces consisting of human communities, families, villages, nations, and humanity. Spirits, gods, deities, stones, sand, mountains, rivers, and animals. Everything in reality is a vital force or energy that such that the harmonious interactions among them strengthen reality. That's view. From this view, or this theocentric and highly vitalist position, you can see a complex network of relationships among human beings with each other, human beings and non-human beings, such as the spiritual, the physical nature. We can also include the past generations in that, present generations, and the future generations as well. So all these beings are vitalists insofar as they are thought like to be alive in the actual sense. They are active in the actual sense, such that they will always have an effect on conceptions of African environmental ethics because of the duties and obligations to which various beings owe each other within that particular network. So this is why it must be taken as a holistic view of environmental ethics. So because of time, I think I will come to my conclusion. All these African environmental ethical perspectives should not be taken to mean that there are no environmental problems either in Africa. Actually, Africa could be experiencing the worst environmental problems and environmental injustice, most of which are not of its own making due to its history of, for example, slavery, colonialism, and continued neocolonialism and other factors within the African environment. So these have had and continue to impact on African existence and ultimately on the African environment in different ways. However, the import of African conceptions of existence to environmental ethics cannot be taken for granted, like what I have argued. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chemhuru. Thank you. That was very, very interesting. And now we'll move on to Professor Carvalho's presentation. Professor Carvalho, if you'll let know when I should show your PowerPoint, I'd appreciate it. I'll be paying attention. Professor Carvalho, your microphone is off.
Oh, thanks very much. Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Felipe, for this invitation and to meet Professor Munamato, whose talk I enjoyed very much, and I hope we can find some contact among our views of environmental ethics. What I present will be called Epistemologies of the Living Cosmos, of the cosmos which is alive, a view from South America. So I'll try to offer here a work in progress, really. So please forgive any imprecision. I know it's a very complex and rich issue, and I'm working on it now, inspired by two approaches to the subject of environmental ethics. One is to understand how to go with intercultural philosophy, as I understand it, say in Brazil, since this is a conversation of world philosophies coming from the Association of Latin American Intercultural Philosophy. And the other is the project called Meeting of Knowledges. That's a project that I began at the University of Brasilia in 2010, 11 years ago, and it's now in over 20 universities in Brazil and some outside. If I unite the two approaches, the intercultural philosophy from a South American band, say, in the Meeting of Knowledges, I have to assume that the environmental and the complexity of the worldviews of the traditional peoples of South America, and also of Africa, I believe, will have to go beyond academic philosophy or professional philosophy if we want to use the classical four trends of African philosophy proposed by Odera Oruka. I mean, we are here in the professional philosophy discussion. But when we move to the traditional peoples, maybe we will have to expand the concept of philosophy to overcome only the academic philosophy. If you're thinking of the concept of intercultural philosophy, if we put the emphasis on the cultural dimension of the word intercultural philosophy, we are thinking of philosophy between cultures or different philosophical cultures. And that takes us to the meeting then of different philosophical cultures. So far, as I understand it, intercultural philosophy has moved between the various written philosophical traditions and compare or cross-interpret texts stemming from different civilizations and languages. Say, the project of Ramad al-Mal, which is of the Hindu philosophy with Western philosophy, Franz Wimmer, many of them, Dussel and so on, is always a discussion that has a point of reference, Western philosophy, and then make the cross-interpretation of written texts of other philosophical traditions. So the field of environmental ethics, to start with, it can be conceived as a trend, as a aspect within Western philosophy that can be a subject of an intercultural debate, or I would say an intercultural reduction. We must reduce the terms of the environmental ethics interculturally. And usually we start with a Western viewpoint, as Professor Munamati said about this Eurocentrism, which just dominates us, at least dominates South American academia and probably even African academia as well. So we usually start from a Western viewpoint, and then we move to Chinese, Japanese, Islamic, Buddhist, and all the other written traditions of thought. So our notion of the discussion tends to be like the Western philosophical tradition is the meta-language, is the grammar from which we start to make the comparisons. On the other hand, environmental ethics from South America demands a necessary dialogue with our Afro-Brazilian and indigenous peoples, with our African-derived and with our African-derived peoples and with indigenous peoples. All of the traditional peoples of South America and Africa, I can more or less generalize, base their worldviews on what I call an epistemology of the living cosmos. As Professor Munamati explained very well in the last point of the ontology and cosmology of the theocentric view, is very similar. On the other hand, Western worldview, which is behind Western academic philosophy, is based on an epistemology of an inert or dead cosmos. For this reason, and I can give some example of this dead cosmos, I believe in an environmental ethical, which will establish dialogue and which will do justice to the sophistication of an environmental ethical approaches of the people of our two continents. We'll have to search for other epistemic traditions that are also based on epistemologies of the living cosmos. To make it reduce it very simply, Descartes initiated probably this perspective of an inert or a dead cosmos. In the moment that they reject the senses as a secure source for knowledge, rejected the other aspects of even abilities like intuition, and rejected the cosmos as a living being. So he opened the road for Galileo that says if the cosmos would speak a language, that would be a mathematical language, that would be a language of circles and triangles and so on. That's rather funny because that's the only language that he could listen to and understand, as if I decree that the cosmos is mute outside mathematics, because mathematics is the only thing that I can really understand. So it becomes like a tautological affirmation by Galileo. And finally, Newton that closes then this idea of what we could call a Cartesian, Galilean, Newtonian cosmos, which is a dead cosmos. this tradition, this epistemology about that cosmos is the one that we all have in our universities. It's all that inspire and in a way grounds our academic efforts. This has a long story, but the point of importance here is that this epistemology may have worked for some areas of knowledge, but when it comes to environmental ethics, it is not particularly apt because it doesn't have the grammar of a living cosmos. So it can hardly be enough to understand the complexities of the interrelations and the interconnectedness, as Professor Munamati said. So my point with contact then with the African philosophy in this moment is with the project of the Meeting of Knowledges. If I can just explain it very briefly. The Meeting of Knowledges is a project that somehow connects with Odero Oruka's proposal of a sage philosophy. I mean, Oruka went right to the villages in Kenya and listened to the Luo, to the Kikuyu, listened to the sages and the masters, and transcribed their conversations. And then he went back to the University of Nairobi, and then he elaborated on that. But he was, as if he was saying, he was looking. He had a measurement, and went there to measure whether the people he would find would more or less go inside the measure that he has, that they were supposed to be the sage that he was looking for. And I can pass from Oruka's perspective, proposal, to Madavo's in Munamato Chamburu's book, which is I found very interesting in the Garikai Madavo, when he lessons from the rainmakers, more cosmological perspectives. Madavo brings the rainmakers, and said we should pay attention to them. What we do in the Meeting of Knowledges is we make it a more radical step. We bring the rainmakers to become our colleagues and teach in our universities with us. As if after Oruka went to the Kikuyu, to the Luo, and listened to them, they would bring them to the University of Nairobi and they would speak. Then we will have what I call a Meeting of Knowledges. So our aim is to invite the masters, female and male masters of traditional knowledges from the African-derived communities, from the indigenous nations, and from the many other traditional peoples to teach universities in regular courses, in dialogue with us, professors with an Eurocentric academic upbringing. So an intercultural philosophy, as I understand it, has to be an interepistemic dialogue. It's a dialogue between different epistemics, different epistemologies. Some of these different epistemologies may be more compatible. They may be more commensurable. The problem is that our reference, our epistemological reference, makes it incommensurable because it's the epistemology of that cosmos. And although we invite masters from all areas, from sciences, technologies, arts, and spiritual traditions, the majority of the masters are people with great knowledge of cosmology, of mythology, of philosophy, of medicinal plants, and with other connections with the earth, with the water, with the different biomes and natural environments, such as marshes, forests, savannas, rivers, and the sea. So if we take Brazil as a kind of a subcontinent, I'll give just 4 masters, like Antonio Bispo, who's a powerful master who's a philosopher. He's a Maroon from the Maroon Society, those who fled from the plantations and led free lives, free communities. Like in Haiti, there are many still Maroons. In Jamaica, in Brazil, there are thousands of Maroon communities. Bispo lives in the semi-arid. His biome is almost like a semi-arid desert-like, with a very specific kind of plants and animals and the meteorological conditions proper of that area. For example, in that same semi-arid, in the state of Ceará, there are people that we call prophets of rain prophets, that they will be the equivalent of the rainmakers that Madavos quotes. And it's so wonderful because in the state of Ceará, they have the meteorological, the province, not the state, the meteorological state institution, because it's a place that has difficulty with rain. It's a very arid area. So they sit in a table once in a year, the scientists of the Meteorological Institute and the rain prophets. And then they look to their findings, because the rain prophet, they look to the ants, to the rats, to the different birds of the semi-arid, to the way the rivers are, the color of the sand, the smell of the wind, the way the clouds are. They are incredibly sophisticated. The way branches are broken and breaking in the different trees. And from the amazing sum of indices of observation, they say it will rain in the May of June around the 20th of June. The rain prophets will say that. And then the scientists with all their equipment and so on will more or less say something. In this state, we can see an intercultural science and intercultural philosophy. And what is important is that people who live in that environment, the environment is alive, speaks to them. They can understand the language of the environment. And that's a direct language, whereas from science, we will have the prophecies, will be the instruments. So this leads, just the case of the semi-arid environment. There are others that I'll make in a moment. If we say that the epistemology, the rain prophets are certainly within an epistemology of a living cosmos. The ants, everybody, the ants, the trees, the branches, the birds, everyone is speaking and they're interacting. There is an alternative to Cartesian, Galilean, Newtonianism epistemology of the dead cosmos, that maybe we can have a better relationship and dialogue, which is Goethe, which is the Goethean science. Goethe's study of the metamorphosis of the plants, he made like in a phenomenological, really said, the plant will tell me the way she is, the way it is. And she'll tell me their growth, their dynamism. The plant is a living being that can relate to me. So his book of Metamorphosis of Plants will be an example of someone who is dialoguing with a cosmos who is alive. And especially his great struggle against Newton's interpretation of the light. And Goethe will say, I don't need a prism. I want to look at the sun, to look at the light as it impacts my eyes. Then I can make the spectrum of colors. So in Goethe, we have like a seed of a different Western perspective that maybe will dialogue better with Ubuntu, will dialogue better with our indigenous peoples. I mean, we don't have to reject Western epistemology as such. We can make more connection with the ones that have more affinities with ours. And a consequence of Goethe in the 20th century that is very interesting to compare with our indigenous and African communities is anthroposophy. Anthroposophical medicine, which is quite effective, Sinodorum and Rhinodorum, Strethodor, all those Veleda medicines. Interesting, because like homeopathy, you use a tiny bit of an element diluted in water, and that will rearrange your energy. What is important is that those elements, although they are everywhere, even outside where I am now, you only pick those elements from creeks and brooks and small rivers or lakes that are untouched, that are naturally preserved. Why? The formula, the chemical formula is the same, but the fact is this: in the crooks that are protected among trees in what we call the ciliar forests, the tree that protect, say, a spring, a water spring, the elemental spirits are present. What they call the elementals. That's the old European tradition of spirits. The elementals will then bring the energy to the elements. that come in the medicine. That is quite similar to the way specialists in medicinal plants work, because for the herbalists that we have, the plant is a living being. The plant speaks to the herbalist, is a friend, and it's the plant that cures, and not an element that is separated by a chemical process, an active element that you put in a medicine that you put in your body. It's the plant is alive. So that means that the cosmos is alive, and the healer is a triangle. Everybody's alive. The tree, the plant is alive, the leaf is alive, the healer is alive, and the patient is alive. The plant allows her extra power, her extra capacity of cure to be transferred to the person. Another master comes from the Atlantic forest. In the Atlantic forest, the biome is already incredibly mixed with marshes, with jungles, the mix of the Atlantic forest that nears the sea, and where the environment comes to a mixture of salt water and sweet water. Animals and plants, they all come from that different area. So the knowledge that comes is integral of that particular biome. So although the cosmos is alive, is living, we are relating to them, or they are relating to them, as we are relating to each other. We're all human beings, but I'm relating now to Professor Muramata, who I'm seeing here, not as a general of a human being, as someone who is Muramata Chamuru, who has a specific way of being. So in a way, the abstraction is what separates us, is the level of abstraction that generalizes too often before we really get in touch with cosmos as such. So dialoguing then with the masters is like teaching us the language of the cosmos, because academia didn't educate us to understand the language of the cosmos, unless you come from a traditional community, from a traditional people. Usually on the other way, because we are inherited the mathematical language of a cosmos who is dead. So the meeting of knowledges makes these interepistemic dialogues. How that I see it in terms of South America then? An environmental ethics that has these roots, say, in our continent, and I believe in Africa will be similar, it should be developed philosophically from our capacity to hear and to dialogue to those masters and females and male masters of the peoples who live under those principles of that environmental ethics. They will be our colleague philosophers. We'll have to find room in the universities for the written tradition of philosophy together with the oral tradition of philosophy. Or, as I understand it, only when we have the two being together in a department, in a faculty, together teaching the students, we will then start having an intercultural approach in our countries. And here in Brazil, we'll have two basic of them, two basic lines. I don't want to be too long. The African, that we can call Afro-Brazilian, but as I understand it, it is Afro-Brazilian because one part of the African tradition in Brazil is also syncretized, it enter into a relationship with Christianity and also with the indigenous peoples. So on one hand, I would say it would be Afro-Brazilian cosmologies, Afro-Brazilian worldviews. On a second level, I would say it would be Afro-diasporic, because we find similarities with the Afro-Cuban. For instance, the Candomblé in Brazil will be very similar to Santeria. So it could be Afro-Caribbean, it could be Afro-South American, so it could be Afro-diasporic, and it could be African, stricto sensu. So there will be two main worldviews that inspire thousands and thousands of communities and this epistemology of the living cosmos. The first one will be from the West Africa, with two poles, mainly the Yoruba, from Nigeria and from Benin, the Yoruba big tradition of the Orishas, and from the side of Benin and from Togo, the Fon, or Jeje as we call them, with the Voduns. There are some similarities between the Orishas and Voduns of the Fon peoples. They, among them, then, we will have, similar to what I said about the rain prophets. For the Orishas, you will have the gods of nature. So they will rule over rivers, over waterfalls, over lakes, over forests, over the sea, over thunder, over lightning, over rainbow. And for instance, one god, Ogun, who's the god of iron. So if I have this knife with me here, I can invoke Ogun here because there is iron in the knife. So Ogun is present. So even in industrial, because it's transcends modern technology. There's a wonderful book called Ogun, A New God for a New Age, saying that Ogun has been from the Neolithic to now. So all the elements, all the plants of the wind, of the rain, they are all speaking for the traditions of the Candomblé and for the masters of Candomblé. When they come to teach at the universities that they have been doing, the students are absolutely amazed because they have to learn to listen to the wind, to listen to the rain, to pay attention to words that are being invoked, to objects that are brought that have energy. It's like if you come to become like a 7 years old who are learning to literacy. We are now kind of an literacy of a living cosmos because we learn that the cosmos is dead. The Vodun would be similar, the Jeje. And the other great tradition that Professor Munamato is connected with is the Bantu, as we used to call here the Angola, the great Bantu tradition with the Nkisis, with the gods. There are some equivalent that we make here, but the whole world of forces, of energies that you described, even temples. I mean, some of my colleagues, because Kabengele Munanga, one of my friends who's Congolese, he still defends temples because he says temples book is called Bantu philosophy. So according to him, that was decolonizing because he says there is philosophy among the Bantu. Even if the book, there's a lot of problems of being a missionary and so on. But that is Munangas, who a friend of mine will say that. So there is another connection now, a third one, if I don't want to be as long. In 2019, I participated in a colloquium of Oriental philosophy at the University of Campinas. In my view, we must start an intercultural discussion, a dialogue with the other traditions of living cosmos. The Oriental tradition can dialogue with our indigenous traditions and our African traditions, maybe more easily than Western tradition. That particular colloquium, I was in two of them, had the same name, the following title: Nature Against Nature and Interculturality. That's the title of the colloquium. The title was suggested by Ohashi Ryosuke, a philosopher from Kyoto, who is the follower of Kitaro Nishida, the founder of the Kyoto School of Philosophy in the beginning of 20th century. We're now more like 1 century, of the Kyoto School, who, in my view, will be the first intercultural philosophy tradition, really, because they were dialoguing with the West and recreating on basis of this dialogue. The concept of nature against nature was done by Ryosuke. It's typically Nishidian, with a self-contradictory statement about nature rejecting itself as nature. We humans are part of nature, and we have placed ourselves in this modern technological era as destructors of nature, that is, as anti-nature. So the identity of nature is therefore a classical example of Nishida's concept of absolutely self-contradictory identity. We as human beings are absolutely self-contradictory identity as nature. And here, We must not forget the antecedent of the living paradox of nature against nature through mankind, by invoking Karl Marx's concept of man as a species being, Gattungswesen, as Marx said. To say that man's physical and mental life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature. So as Marx started earlier in the philosophical manuscript, comes to Nishida and to Ryosuke, preoccupied with the destruction of the environment, say that is nature against nature through us, through ourselves. Through ourselves is important. Who is ourselves? We are not the masters of the Yoruba or the Fan or the Ubuntu or the 305 nations of the indigenous people in Brazil. We are the Eurocentric part of the self-destructing natural living beings. So our connection should be to the others who didn't pursue the same line of self-destructiveness. And here I could give an interesting case, which is Buddhism. Buddhism will be an interesting case for an intercultural discussion of environmental ethics, because the Buddhist discourses were not directed to humans, but to sentient beings, as Munamoto said of sentience, that included all the animal species. Buddha didn't say human being, but sentient beings. This is an important step beyond the Abrahamic anthropocentrism, because it admits sentient beings beyond humans. However, Lambert Schmidhausen, the great specialist in Yogacara Buddhist philosophy, went to great pains to survey the entire Pali Canon, the Nikaya, the Sutta Nipata, the Digha Nikaya, the Majjhima Nikaya, and so on, to find out whether plants could be treated as sentient beings. And he concluded that they are not. So we can discuss with Buddhism to a certain extent. But there is another tradition that we can make a dialogue with, and I think it would be fruitful, which is Taoism. Maybe Taoism will dialogue better with Ubuntu and dialogue better with the traditional peoples of African and indigenous descent in Brazil than Western. Taoism is a project of an ecological civilization, as an author said recently. Some concept of Taoism will be important to remember. Wu Wei, for instance, the not interference. And the way Wu Wei, you act by not acting. You interfere by not interfering. And another important concept is the concept of the uncarved block. The block that is uncarved, like a jade, that you don't have to sculpture it, to carve it, just leave it as it is. Nature as it stands and as it presents itself to human beings. It is enough to us to acquiesce to nature as it is. In this sense, I believe Taoism is the oldest philosophical position of the written ones to overcome anthropocentrism. We cannot measure how many thousands of years of African and indigenous people have come to this conclusion of being overcoming anthropocentrism in terms of written texts, right? The oldest philosophical position to overcome anthropocentrism and to sustain an environmental ethics that is already conscious of the decline of the living cosmos, that already in his time of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, fighting against Confucius and the organization of society based on the abuse and exploitation of nature. To follow the Tao means not to interfere. Master Antonio Bispo, one of the masters of the Maroons, he said that the role of human beings is just to re-edit nature. That's the way. He would be a sage philosopher in the case of Oruka. He says, the role of human beings is to re-edit nature. After one crop, we prepare the next harvest. And the fruits will follow suit in the next corresponding season or year. Bispo stresses the usefulness of the reproduction of life. We use nature without abuse. Zhuangzi goes a step further and stresses the uselessness or mere living. His story about the oak tree, that's a famous story, which was good for nothing. You couldn't use its branches to make a chair. You couldn't eat its fruits, it was too bitter. You could lie behind for its shadow, gave headache. So that oak lived hundreds of years unharmed and unnoticed. Thus, Zhuangzi stresses the usefulness of the uselessness. Then the story about the happiness of the fish in the water, discussing with the two philosophers, how do you know that the fish are being happy now in the middle of the water? That's a wonderful discussion of interspecies that appear in Zhuangzi. I mean, if we read Zhuangzi for some of our indigenous masters, of our African masters, they will find resonance of ideas and relationship that they have with nature. So what I'm saying is that, and as we open the discussion below Western, we can then make a richer intercultural world. And I just gave two examples more. What I suggest, for instance, in the case of Madavo, no? The rainmakers, they would be, in my view, they would be fully equals to us. So I don't think that they are folk ecology. I mean, it would be wonderful to have them as professors, as we are doing here. So maybe our environmental ethics will be enlarged by giving them names and surnames. I mean, who the specific rainmakers that can dialogue. In this, finally, in this 219 discussion, this colloquium of intercultural colloquium, which is one called Nature Against Nature and Interculturality. I proposed that we started with the first intercultural section of it. And I invited 4 indigenous masters, 2 male and 2 female, from 4 different nations of Brazil. There are 305 different nations speaking around 200 different languages. One of them, who is a Guarani, is a famous nation, indigenous nation that we have them in Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Argentina. The area where the Guarani lives cuts across 5 countries. Miguel Jorge, the Guarani, he spoke about the interconnectedness of everything, of the kinship of everything, the kinship of the canoe and the river, the kinship of the bow and the game that you kill. One of the professors was fascinated and connected with the Indra's net of the Hawaiian Buddhism and with the Leibniz. So we can open an amazing discussion with the 4 of them. They all spoke from this perspective of a living cosmos. So this is practically a last thing about environment, if I'm just closing it. In the word environment, if you take the etymology, comes from environ, a French word of the 16th century, that we could translate as the surroundings of the subject who speaks and observes. I mean, the human being. So the word environment encapsulated us in the center and the rest around us. So the word is anthropocentric in its origin. When you say in Portuguese, ambiente, that's the word for environment in Portuguese, and ambiente even in Spanish, it comes from the Latin ambience, to walk around a certain point. Or that is, a physical exterior space of a particular human being. When Jorge Guarani speaks about the kingship of all the living things, beings and animals and plants and river and winds and rains and all the spirituals that are around them, we must find another word that does not place ourselves here and everything around us. Maybe the word cosmos, for the moment, will do to imagine a kind of a cosmocentric perspective, if we understand cosmos as a circumference that is everywhere without a center. So that is, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Carvalho. That was very, very interesting. We seem to have a little problem with echo, or no, it's fixed. So once again, thank you very much, Professor Carvalho. That was very, very interesting. So the next section in our conversation would be for either of you to ask the other questions. I don't know if We can begin with Professor Chempuru. Professor Chempuru, I don't know if you have any questions or comments you would like to discuss with Professor Carvalho. Professor Chempuru, your microphone's off. It's still off. Give me a second. Let's see if... no, it hasn't turned on yet.
All right, yeah, it's on now.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, to Professor Carvalho, it's not really a question as such, but it's a compliment to his presentation. I particularly enjoyed his lectures on Oruka, and also I am interested with his idea of proposing for some kind of an intercultural philosophy, which is actually some kind of a South-South dialogue between philosophies, African philosophy and South American philosophy. Really an area that we can look at going forward. I think I'll be willing to be part of the engagement. And I was also interested with his idea, like when he looks at the scientists, like indigenous knowledge on the one hand and scientific knowledge on the other side, in terms of how they can benefit from each other. I think it's a very important perspective that we as philosophers also need to work on. But otherwise, I enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Carvalho, of course, you can add anything you would like, and you're more than invited to ask questions or comment Professor Chempuru's presentation.
Well, Professor Chempuru's, what I would really like to inquire, to ask you, what about the possibilities as you see it? Because as you say, even turning back to Oruka, but he had this initiative of going there, listening to the sages, and coming back. How do you envisage the possibilities of doing something like the meeting of knowledges in some African universities? Because your situation must be similar to ours. I mean, there will be hundreds of different masters, female and female masters of all the areas, no? That we could benefit from it. That you could benefit, our students would benefit from having them around. I have the discussion with José Castiano from Mozambique and Severino Ngoenha, the two Mozambican philosophers. He has this book here, I can translate to you, it's called The Local Knowledges in Academia. That is José Castiano from the Technological University of Maputo. Local Knowledges in Academia, Conditions and Possibilities of Its Legitimacy. It's a rather Kantian argument, no? How the conditions and legitimacy. But I mean, they understand that the local knowledges have to be in academia. But I know it's difficult. But I just would like to know, I mean, how is the traditional knowledge is being dealt with in African university in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, whatever you want, Africa. Even from Madavos, when he managed the rainmakers, I don't know if he thinking that some rainmakers might have been invited. This is what I would like to know. How is the traditional knowledge inside universities? That's it.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's a very important question. Maybe I would want to indicate that perhaps Oruka is one of the first, one of the philosophers within the first generation of African philosophers who are trying to kind of do a search in terms of how African philosophy could actually legitimize itself, especially against that background that I indicated. So Oruka initially identified some trends in African philosophy or some approaches to African philosophy. like sage philosophy, which we have looked at in your presentation, where he was interested in identifying some wise men and, of course, women in his indigenous society. So he would interview individuals that could be identified as sages who possess some high level of wisdom compared to the general populace. So the product of that is what he termed sage philosophy. Related to that is also a view that is called ethnophilosophy, which is concerned with the sum of, like we can come up with knowledge from different sages in different communities. So the sum total of sage philosophy, when we look at it as some kind of a universal philosophy from these individual sages, that's what we can look at as ethnophilosophy, which is concerned with the philosophical outlook of different ethnic communities, but with some kind of universal perspectives on fundamental issues. And the other third trend is nationalist ideological philosophy. Like during the period of African colonialism, we see certain individuals who are critical in terms of the situation that they are actually finding themselves in. And they reflect, they conscientize their fellow Africans to say, no, we have to fight colonialism, we have to fight injustice. So that kind of philosophy has come to be called nationalist ideological philosophy, because they are concerned with the national interests of their territories, of their countries, and they try to conscientize their fellows so that they confront injustice, they confront colonialism as a united people. Then the fourth trend would be what is called professional African philosophy, which borrows heavily from Western approaches to philosophy. And the professional African philosophy is basically what we most of our generation are actually exposed to. Like we read Western philosophy first, we familiarize ourselves with the Western texts, then we reflect and come back and say, but I'm an African philosopher, I ought to look at these issues from a particular African philosophical standpoint. But fundamentally, my approach will be rooted in some kind of, we call it professional African philosophy, but it's basically Western approaches to African philosophy, or analytic approaches to African philosophy. So all these could be how best to look at African philosophy. With regard to Oruka's sage philosophy, it also has its own share of problems, because they attempted to look at sages, identifying individuals with some understanding, some depth understanding on fundamental issues. It tended to be kind of more focused on individuals, let's say, than on what could be representative of African philosophy. And also connected with it is also ethnophilosophy, which is a product of ethnophilosophy. It also is also accused for being somewhat anthropocentric. And even sage philosophy itself, it also lacks some bit of criticality compared to the analytic approaches to philosophy. So these are some of the problems that have been associated with those approaches.
And what about the traditional knowledges in Great Zimbabwe University, for instance? How do you see that?
Yeah, we try to look at them. We try to trace the important traditional knowledge paradigms, traditional knowledge, traditional wisdom, and we don't take it like traditional approaches to certain issues. We just don't take everything. But if it is to be part of African philosophy, we critically assess certain knowledge and see whether it actually qualifies to be part of what will be African philosophy.
Okay, thank you very much for all that information, Professor Chemhuru. That's very, very interesting. I was actually telling Professor Chemhuru before the conversation began that here in Latin America we have a lot of problem gaining access to information about African philosophy. We even if we are interested, it's very, very difficult to find somebody who can actually provide us with bibliographical tips and so on. So what you just said is, I think, will be very, very appreciated by a lot of our viewers. Okay, so I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask, many questions I'd like to ask both of you, actually. But first, I'd rather we take up the questions from the public, and if we have time at the end, I'll ask my own. So our first question is from Ana Rico from the philosophy department of El Bosque University, and she asks, climatic crisis is a threat to humanity. From these philosophies, what can be suggested to have a different relation with nature? That question is for both of you. Professor Carvalho, would you like to answer first?
Sorry, can you come again?
Of course. I'll read it once again. It's climatic crisis is a threat to humanity. From these philosophies, what can be suggested to have a different relation with nature? And perhaps Professor Carvalho, would you like to begin?
Okay, I may give thank you, Ana Rico, for the question. I would say we'll have two ways that we can follow. One of them is to use our science the best we can to face the threat to humanity with our machines that we have, with our resources from science. Another way would be to listen to those people who live closer to the environment, closer to nature, in the different biomes, in the different environments, from the polar Arctic, to the desert, from everywhere, from the Amazon forest, and learn from them the alternatives. They can see how they are seeing the crisis. We have some of our indigenous masters here, like David Copenhauer. Many of them are saying that the sky is falling, as they say, the earth is falling. And he has his own view of this, that the earth is falling. Because we have lost the subtlety of observation, even of climate. The only line we have is a scientific line. So I would suggest to pay attention to the other sciences, which are not Western science. The only way is to invite those scientists, those people who have these knowledges, to dialogue with us, to tell us what we don't know. This is the way I think I'm more hopeful in the case that I believe there is a lot of people who know alternatives that we don't. The whole idea is to dialogue with them.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Carvalho. Professor Chemhuru, would you like to add something?
Yeah, maybe. I think the response to our climate crisis, or the threat to our climate, will be basically be addressed by a change in attitude, a change in human attitude, like adjusting the way we relate with the environment from our anthropocentric views of nature to some strive to at least reach it anthropocentric views, where we look at nature as something that has moral status, or different aspects of the environment, like even we can talk of animate beings, non-animate beings. So if we try to look at them as our moral counterparts within the planet Earth, I think we can reach at some sort of a non-anthropocentric approach. And related to that, like I have indicated in the presentation, we may also have to rethink in terms of our ontology, our existence as human persons. whether we are the only superior beings on planet Earth, and if not, how best can we contribute welfare, well-being, interconnectedness with which we find ourselves in with the rest of beings. So that could be strengthened by the communitarian view, where we look at the environment as part of our community. And we also add to that with the idea of humaneness. If we try to be humane to various aspects, various objects of the natural environment, that we relate with on a day-to-day basis. So that taken together, I think it will go a way towards giving the environment some sort of moral status so that we can avert climate crisis.
Thank you very much, Professor Chamhuru. So we have here a couple of questions from Juan Camilo Palacios, both of them for Professor Chamhuru, I guess. I'll read both of them because I think they're related. You might want to answer them together. The first is, has colonialism had any negative impact on the ethical conception of Ubuntu? And the second question would be, from the viewpoint of Ubuntu philosophy, could non-human beings have a moral status? Would they be moral agents? I think you more or less answered this one a second ago, but those are the questions.
If you can take the second question again.
The second is, from the viewpoint of Ubuntu philosophy, do non-human beings have a moral status? Are they moral agents?
Okay. All right. I think I will address them in their order. The first one, which has to do with colonialism in terms of whether it has had impact on Ubuntu. I think it has strongly affected the status of Africans, particularly their conception of Ubuntu. Because when we look at the notion of Ubuntu, we are looking at the human being, both metaphysically and epistemologically. So we are looking at two dimensions, the metaphysical and the epistemic dimension. So if we understand what colonialism entails, like colonialism has to do with it's actually a philosophy of kind of oppression. It's a philosophy that is actually responsible for oppressing a certain population on the basis of maybe like colonialism was mainly based by it has some racist kind of background to it. It also has to do with the dispossession of indigenous African people in terms of their property. So a lot of fundamental human rights were actually committed through colonialism. And those violations of fundamental human rights have actually an impact on the ontological status of human beings. It actually affects the African people, because it actually dehumanizes them. It takes away their fundamental rights to themselves, to their property, to their fundamental property, like land, like subjugating them, oppressing them. And colonialism actually had a lot of like political political authority. You are actually taking away everything. It's actually dispossessing people of everything. So it takes away their Ubuntu. It also takes away people's conception of morality. Then the second question in terms of whether Ubuntu has a conception of moral status or gives moral status to non-human beings. Yeah, I think it does, because Ubuntu has to do with humaneness, not only within the human community, but it also transcends to other non-human beings. Like I indicated in my presentation, that we judge a person in terms of whether one possesses or lacks Ubuntu, not only on the basis of how one relates with the other human beings per se, but even the way one treats non-human beings, the way even how one treats the natural environment, we can assess someone in terms of whether one lacks or possesses Ubuntu. And like I also indicated, that it's not something that is permanent in or within individuals. It is something at which individuals would fail at, such that we can assess various moral actions that the person performs and judge whether one possesses or lacks Ubuntu in terms of what he or she will get.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Chemhuru. Now, for Professor Carvalho, I have a couple of questions from Juan Camilo Cajigas. He sent them elsewhere. From Cajigas with a little addenda from me. They come with a tax, if you will. So the first question is, how do you feel? I mean, keeping in mind what you have just told us, that it is a mistake to assume that Western philosophy should act as the meta language for all philosophies, how do you feel about attempts to understand non-Western traditions using formal logic, even if it's non-traditional, non-classical formal logic? And the second question is, in some of your writings, you have mentioned that part of the problem with Western philosophy has to do with it being script-centric, something of the sort, I think would be the translation, too centered on the written language instead of taking into account the oral language. What impact do you think, more specifically, adopting a philosophical method that is centered on the oral language would have in ontological and epistemological terms? Those are the questions.
Oh, thank you. That was quite challenging questions. And I remember now that I forgot to show some of the slides. There is at least one that, if you could allow me to show, maybe near the end, at least 2 slides, because when I spoke, I forgot. But I can answer now these 2 questions. No, I'm a fan of Jonathan Shmakonam, the African philosopher. I'm sure that Professor Chemhuru knows him. The Ezumezu logic. That's a wonderful logic because of that logical. Yeah, the Ezumezu, the Igbo logic. It's wonderful, Shmakonam. Yeah. I mean, he has a project. I mean, I'm fascinated by his works because the Omalo, and so on, Otuolu, Omalo, because he has a project, right, of an epistemology, of an ontology, of an ethics from an African philosophical perspective. Yes, I'm trying to apply Ezumezu in a way to the question of the master, because the masters, we call them mestres, which is a nice word in Portuguese, a mixture of sages. The one who knows, as I say, the master is the one who knows, the one who teaches. He's a kind of a wise person as well. I put many meanings of master. The master is not the one before that. The master is not exactly a professor. It's not exactly like an academic. It is an Ezumezu connection. It's similar and different at the same time. No, I'm too much on. I think logic, non-formal logic is very important. I do believe it is. Many. Yeah, we are. Eshu, for instance, Eligbara, Eshu. The Yoruba god. Eshu is a kind of a trickster god. Eshu is beyond yes or no. He's always at the crossroads. Where you in a crossroad, you usually have 3 alternatives and not 2. If I am here and I come to a crossroad, it's not only 2, because I can go here, and I can go back to. So it's only 3 alternatives, not 2. It's not a binary logic. And there is what they call a male crossroad and a female crossroad. That's a female. A male crossroad. I come to this female crossroad. I have 4 alternatives. I have 4 places to go. No, I can discuss. That's what I'm saying. Nagarjuna, you know, the tetralemma of Buddhist epistemology can dialogue with the Shu, for instance, can dialogue with the Legba. So I'm agree with that. I'm fan of it. And the second, about the language, the oral tradition, this for me is the real challenge. I don't know how we have to make it appear like the Babalawo Raiz de Omalo, no, of the Igbo or the Nganga, that I'm sure Professor Munamato knows Ngangas, no? Either we dialogue with the written word, or then we exclude it and believe that the only knowledge that is really firm and sustainable is the knowledge of the written language. So you make a new protocol, a new epistemology, a new epistemic protocol that accounts for written texts and for oral texts is, for me, the way to decolonize universities in the South, be them in South America, be in Africa, in Asia, in Oceania. They all have excluded oral traditions, and the courses, you know, the texts that are used, the way that you classify people and approve or reprove, always based on written texts. So, decolonize it is to decolonize the written prestige over written traditions. That's what Amadou Ampateba was telling in a long time, and many others. If I could just show here two slides very quickly. One more, Felipe, because I want, if you can pass another one, the one that you showed, the epistemology of the living cosmos. Just go.
Yes, of course.
Backwards, maybe. And the one is the other indigenous woman. I'd like to show both of them, the indigenous woman. Here, what I'm saying is that traditional peoples of the world, like 5% of the traditional peoples in the world, they are present in Americas, in Africa, in Asia, in Eurasia, Middle East, Oceania. They are less present exactly in Europe, where philosophy dominates. There are thousands of worldviews that relate to cosmos as a living being, including spirits and so on. Integration of knowledges, integration of abilities, integration of skills. Whereas we are separating our abilities, our skills. We have become like atrophied of many in hypertrophy knowledge only, reason. Full exercise of science, technology, the arts, spirituality. Total activation of the 5 senses, to hear, to see, to listen, to touch, affect and empathy as a source of knowledge and communication. Attention and trust to one's intuition. This I take from other literature, really. Daily interaction, communication, participation, collaboration with plants and animals. Constant communication with spiritual entities. Cosmocentrism. Can you imagine? We live in an academic world that we expel all of that. I mean, our world could be richer if those masters would be present. And the next one is just a very simple, is that that's a Guajá woman. The Guajá are from the Maranhão, which is part already of the Amazon forest. This photograph is taken from the Folha de São Paulo. It's the main newspaper in Brazil, from São Paulo, right? That's what I'm saying. It is not an exotic photograph. I'm not showing it as an exotic photograph. If the only thing I complain is that the fact that the name of the woman is not present, and they didn't ask her, I suppose, if she would allow her picture to be taken, although we cannot recognize her face, nor even of the baby. An expression of the daily life of someone whose environment ethics is to relate fully to the living cosmos. After they return from hunt, the Guajá people bring the children of the wild pigs they kill and raise them as their own offspring. They go for hunt and get the wild pig as game. But then they bring the orphans, and then she will feed the orphans. For the traditional peoples in the 5 continents, as well as for the Taoists and Buddhists, the Guajá woman's attitude will make complete sense. It does make sense. On the other hand, for the Abrahamic, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic, and the modern Western worldview, it not only does not make sense, as it will cast a doubt as to the woman's fully developed humanity. I mean, she's a primitive, right? Whatever that means in terms of the nature against nature metaphor. That a friend of mine sent me this picture, and I want to show it to you because it has many elements in it, right? The care, the motherhood, right? The interspecies communication, right? The two babies together. There are so many things that we can, and of course, we could invite someone like her to speak, the challenge is to dialogue with her. I think that's it. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Carvalho. That was a beautiful picture. So we have time for the last two questions. I think the first one is for Professor Cempuru from Luz Pastran, and she asks, must I then understand that, according to African philosophy, God is nothing but a human existence?
God is nothing but
a human existence.
Maybe I must kind of admit that it's a little bit quite complex to me, the question, but maybe I'll try to respond to it the way I understand it. The idea of God in African philosophy, of course, it has its problems because it's a pointer to something that is metaphysical. Because when we talk about God, we are talking about the spiritual. So it's actually a problem in the first place, because we are talking at something which we cannot empirically verify in experience and see and conceptualize the notion of God. Of course, a philosophy of religion has also its approaches trying to reach at the justification that at least God exists, the various arguments for the existence of God. From an African philosophical perspective, we actually also have the same metaphysical arguments for the existence of God, and at the same time, we also have also problems in actually trying to really conceptualize God's existence. So it's not something that I can say, yes, according to African philosophy, God exists. Because, yeah, we can talk of God, we can talk of other spiritual beings like ancestors and the like. So different philosophers, just like different individuals, some believe that these spiritual beings exist, some do not. But from an African philosophical standpoint, it's not that straightforward whether we can accept it or deny that these things that exist. It just depends on how maybe one takes it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Cempuru. And our last question, also from Luz Pastran, is for Professor Carvalho. And it says, may we conclude that philosophy is innate for every civilization? So it's definitely not universal. And besides, does it also change in time?
Sorry, could you say it again? Is not universal?
The question, I'll rephrase it a bit. Okay. She's asking, are we allowed to conclude that philosophy and the truths, I'm guessing that's what she's asking, the truths philosophy provides us with are relative to different cultures, relative to different times? Aren't there universal philosophical truths?
I would say I would be a kind of a middle way. What I'm trying to say is that historical processes have somehow separated Western philosophy, what we call philosophy from the Greeks and so on, from other traditions of speculation, of thinking, of pondering about the world, about ethics, ontologies, that didn't pass through such a dramatic process as capitalism, colonialism, imperialism in Europe. The process that you have a cosmos that died somehow, it's a very dramatic process. It is not the case in India. It's not the case in China because Taoism and Confucianism is still alive. It's not the case in Asia. It's not the case in Africa. It's not the case in Indonesia, in Oceania, not in South America. So maybe there are affinities that we haven't explored yet between, as you say, South-South dialogue, as Professor Munamato would say. And the challenge will be for European philosophy to come to terms with its difficulty in getting a ground, and maybe to invite, to learn from the other traditions of philosophy, to do the reverse of what the Kyoto school did. I think they are wonderful because Nishida said, well, I must read William James, I will read the European Brentano and so on. It is, this is talking about pure experience. But Zen has pure experience, so I can philosophize. So he sort of cannibalized the terms of philosophy for his own interest, as what Professor Munamato is doing, and Oruk and Gieki and Wiredo and Shimakonam. I mean, the word can be a Western, but you apply a different meaning, connecting it with a cosmos which is alive. And then we can have a greater dialogue. So it's a middle. It's not completely universal because it's historical, but there are affinities. And we must explore more these affinities. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Well, I'll let both of you know when we're out of the air. So, I'll let both of you know. But before that, I would, here with our public, I would like to thank both of you. This was, for me, certainly, and I'm sure that for a large part, if not all of our audience, a surprisingly interesting and rich conversation. I mean, I think we're all going to leave here with a desire to start new philosophical projects, and we've learned quite a bit. So thank you both for your very, very wonderful presentations and your very accurate answers. I don't know if you want to say anything else as parting words.
Well, thanks very much. For me, it was a great pleasure, an opportunity to participate in this meeting, in this conversation. Thank you very much, Felipe and Professor Munamato.
Yeah, I also want to thank the organizers of these conversations for inviting me to be part of it, and also my colleague presenter, Professor Cavagno. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and of course, thank our audience for very, very interesting questions and conversations with world philosophies going on vacations. We need it. But we'll be back in August with new conversations. We hope to see you all there. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.